Okay. Well, you folks know that I always like to start my presentations, as I have started the research itself, with a research question or one or two research questions. The question that I have that started this particular research was that as we began to understand that the McAllisters were horticulturalists here on the grounds at 423 North Cascade, we kept getting more and more information, and we began to wonder, to what extent were the McAllisters doing this? And then kind of a natural follow-up from that is, why? Why were they doing this? And I've got it written here as, what were their motivations in doing so? So that's what we're going to be focused on tonight. But as many of you folks also know, I fancy myself a historian, and I very much would like to contextualize the conversation. And what I think that that does for us is it gives us a better feel for who these people are, what their motivations were when we understand what the context of the particular action or activities or series of activities are. This is one of my favorite photographs, and I often start presentations with this photograph. This is a picture circa 1875 of North Cascade Avenue. If you look to the top left, you can see that Colorado College has not been, and no buildings have been built on the campus. Cutler Hall has not been built yet. And we can see just a little bit, we can see McAllister House and its bay window right here. Importantly for this conversation, we also can see the backyard of the McAllister house, and we can see a little bit of the front yard of the McAllister house. And I've used this photograph often to try to piece together the activities on the grounds of the McAllister house. Now I'm going to digress here just a moment and explain something that's pertinent to this conversation tonight. And that is, frankly, folks, we do not have a lot of information from the McAllisters or from the community about the McAllisters' activities in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. The McAllisters did not leave a lot of documentation. They didn't journal. They didn't do those sorts of things. We don't have series of letters explaining activities. And so one of the things that's a real challenge for me is to try to piece together information about the McAllisters, and that's what we'll be doing tonight. In this picture, some of the things that I find really interesting, and I know not everybody will, but we see these grounds in the foregrounds here. We can see what people are doing in their yard. This is the famous Paber cottage right in front of us. We see how far away people are putting the well, the latrine. We see if they are gardening. We can see if they are participating in horticulture. Almost all of the trees that you see in this photograph are city trees. They are not the personal trees of those individuals. These are all the city planted trees, which McAllister had a big hand in doing. So one of the interesting things that we now know about the McAllisters was their first year in Colorado Springs. The picture here in the bottom left is circa 1874. They would have just moved into this house. We can see some horticulture already on the grounds of their house. The first growing season that the McAllister are in their house, they've already had things planted. I have a hypothesis that they maybe even planted some of those things the growing season previous to that, the growing season of 1873, when the house would not have been completed. They lived in the Colorado Springs Hotel for a few months when they first came to Colorado Springs in 1872. And then they moved into what we call a shanty on the grounds just to the left of the house here in this picture. And I believe, my hypothesis is that they moved onto the grounds so that they could begin to participate in horticultural activities there on the grounds. We can see some of the apple trees that they have already planted here on the right-hand side. And then of course, this is also one of our favorite pictures here on the right, and that's simply put up to show you that for those of you that don't know it already, not much grows up here on the high plains of Colorado. This is pretty good soil, but it needs irrigation to grow things. So many of the conversations we've had in the past couple of years, folks, regarding the McAllister house, the architecture, the building of it, have led us to an individual, and that is Andrew Jackson Downing. We now know that his work in the 1850s and the 1840s in New York is what became the McAllister house. He was the designer of the McAllister house. He put them into a book that was published in 1850, and it was discovered or researched by either McAllister himself or George Summers, and they found and liked the design of this house and chose it to be their own. So a lot of what we talk about architecturally involves Andrew Jackson Downing. But I'm going to present today some information that might lead us to think that also he gave direction to the McAllisters through his horticultural legacy also. So just a little bit of information about Andrew Jackson Downing. His lifespan, you might notice, is quite short there, 1815 to 1852. He lives in Newburgh, New York. He's the son of a horticulturalist, and he declares himself America's first landscape architect. And we will be talking about him a little bit in this presentation. This is the book that I was referring to, where we now know that the design for the McAllister house comes from. These names of these older books just are fantastic. So this is the entire name, including designs for cottages, farmhouses, and villas, and you can see the publication date, 1850. But of note in this book is that it's not an architectural book per se. It is, we could think of it today as a catalog for people that are looking for architecture and landscape and functionality inside the home, warming, ventilating, things like that. So it's almost a handyman's guide or a manager's guide to how to choose a house that you will like, that will represent you well, and then how the functionality inside that house would take place and how you would build it. And here it is. Here's design number 17. This is by Downing, called Farmhouse in the English Rural Style. Many of you have seen this before, but just look at this first quote here. To such of our readers as are looking for an expression of more beauty in a farmhouse, we present this design. That very much sounds to me like the McAllisters. And I think that the McAllisters possibly followed Downing and his architectural legacy. Just a little bit more about Andrew Jackson Downing. He and his brothers take over their father's successful landscape and nursery business in Newburgh, New York. They ran it for years and years and years, and when Andrew Jackson Downing dies, his brother Charles takes up the business and continues to run it. Andrew Jackson Downing is held in high esteem by the people along the eastern seaboard from New England through the mid-Atlantic. He was famous in that area, and he hobnobbed with some famous artists along the Hudson River Valley there. He was the editor of a magazine called Horticulturalist magazine that he started and was the editor of until the day he died. And he formed his own landscape architecture firm. And he was partners with a gentleman named Calbert Vaux. Calbert Vaux, after Andrew Jackson Downing dies, partners with Frederick Law Olmsted to design Central Park in New York. Here are the important publications of Andrew Jackson Downing's, and of course the two important ones to us regarding this conversation are highlighted. We have Fruit and Fruit Trees of America and the Architecture of Country Homes. So 1850 publication is where the design of this house is, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about Fruit Trees of America. So there it is. It's an 1845 publication This was basically the Bible for fruit growers in the early part of our nation's history. Andrew Jackson Downing established himself as, in particular, the apple expert of the country. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few moments. This particular publication was a very large publication. It had pages and pages of how to graft, how to do all sorts of different things, and then images of all the different types of fruit that were found in the Americas. Very comprehensive volume. Here are some of the different types of information. As I said, it is a technical manual for the most part, and showing people how to do what they're interested in doing regarding orchards, fruit, pomological activity generally, not just apples, all the different types of fruit that can be found in North America. And by the way, how to deal with soil, different aspects, and insects. So even pest management was involved here. So a little bit about how well regarded Andrew Jackson Downing was. This is a picture of what is now downtown Buffalo, New York. And this building on the right here with this tower, this was the location of the first North American Pomological Convention, and it was held in 1848 at that location. The Downing brothers were the darlings of that convention. They brought over with them 143 varieties of apples and exhibited at that convention. And importantly, the convention adopted the authority of Mr. Downing in his Fruits and Fruit Trees of America as their standard in the classification and nomenclature of their fruits. The next convention from this particular organization was held 4 years later, and it was in Philadelphia. So we start to think that maybe the McAllisters were aware. Now, Major McAllister and Elizabeth McAllister would have been quite young in 1852, but possibly their parents would have been interested in Andrew Jackson Downing. So a little bit more about Downing's legacy and his legacy through time, because obviously Downing is working a little bit earlier in the century than when McAllister is going to be coming to Colorado Springs and participating in horticulture. So what we're looking at is what was the legacy of Downing? Would it have been likely that McAllister would have known Downing's work? And from my research, the answer, I believe, is yes, that his legacy persisted actively throughout the 1800s, and that it would have been very easy for McAllister as a grown adult to access information about the legacy of Andrew Jackson Downing. The image that we're looking at is, and down here on the bottom right, is the first structure on Iowa State University's campus. They simply called it the farmhouse. And here is the design to the left of the farmhouse. And it is an Andrew Jackson Downing design. So in 1860, people were actively seeking out Andrew Jackson Downing designs, in part because they knew that his design was very much oriented towards apple orchards. And that's what we're looking at, the trees in this design right here. These are apple orchards. So his legacy was very much intact. As many of us know, Iowa State University becomes one of the great agricultural universities of our country. Here's this great picture again that many of you have seen so many times, and we've already shown once. We've got the McAllisters here, and we can see horticulture already beginning to occur on the McAllister House grounds. Is it right to ask at this point, did Downing's legacy make its way to Colorado Springs? I'm kind of throwing that out there because that's part of what I'm looking at and interested in. McAllisters and other people moving west would have looked at these sorts of publications like Downing's, I believe, and they would have referenced them and used them as reference guides when they were moving west into areas that didn't have a lot of information, certainly no local information about growing. So we're getting to the McAllisters in Colorado Springs here. The McAllisters and other colonists begin to focus on the propagation and cultivation of apples and other fruits. Apples were the logical choice. They were the most popular fruit in our country. They're hardy and long-lasting. Markets had already been established here in Colorado, and so it was logical for these early settlers to come to Colorado and to attempt to grow apples. And it's through their patience, understanding, and communication with other people in the area, as well as people back east, that they became successful over time. So getting onto the property of the McAllisters here, this is an image that I found that kind of describes the size of the McAllister lot here on North Cascade. These are the addresses here. So this is 423 and 431, but the McAllisters bought lots 1 through 8. So they originally bought quite a large piece of property here, and then they sold lots 1 through 3.5 a couple decades later. So they had about 2.5 decades of orchard growth here on this property. This is something that I've put together, folks. This is my rendering of what the McAllister House grounds may have looked like circa 1880. I've used a lot of different sources to put together this information, some of them images, some articles in the Gazette and in the Out West magazine, some books, one by Paber about activity, and then a few writings on the experience of McAllisters and their recommendations to others that are farming. But I would like for us all just to take a look at this and to begin to absorb the comprehensive nature of the horticulture on this activity on these grounds. Even if I'm not completely accurate, I believe that I have the basics down quite well, and it just is completely full with horticultural activity. These are apple trees that were planted relatively quickly on the property here. We've got a vegetable garden with a particular emphasis on strawberries down here, more apple trees on the back of the property, and then we've got Concord grapevines growing here. When we begin to think about the commitment and the time commitment that must have taken for the McAllisters to have success in this activity, we begin to see a little bit more about why they built the house the way they did, the activities that they were going to be undertaking, and what their time dedication was to this property and how that relates to the colony's growth. And we're going to touch up on that in just a moment here. McAllister's garden contained vegetables, and the cultivation is well documented regarding the vegetables. We have a couple journal entries from Major McAllister and his vegetable garden, and Mrs. McAllister's also. And we have some great detail about when they planted, what they planted, and how the success of those particular objects and items in that season. Quite comprehensive. They were growing a lot, and they must have been canning and preserving quite a bit also. Here are these journal entries. They're much more faded than this. I've used digital photography methods to kind of highlight them and bring them out a little bit. But look at the detail that this contains, the dates, the early plantings, the varietals, the success and failure of them, notes. So those of you that are horticulturalists, and I think many of you are, understand that this takes a lot of patience, it takes a lot of work, but also it is very detailed work if you're going to have this type of horticulture on your property, and certainly if you're going to have success with it. I think the Cumberland Triumph is the best strawberry ever grown. Most of the quotations in the following slides are Major McAllister's quotations that we've gotten out of the William Paber book. He loved strawberries, and he really liked his Cumberland Triumph strawberries. Take a look here on the right, and this shows the extent to which the McAllisters prepared the ground. And just wait till we get to apple trees. This is really nothing compared to the preparation of the ground for apple trees. But these are in writings. These are essays that the Horticultural Society sends back and forth in the different counties. And McAllister was famous for his preparation of the land. So if you have trouble with your land at your house, it might be worth your while to consult with McAllister. He may be able to help you with your ground preparation. Heavy manuring, planting in rows that are standard, beds carefully mulched every autumn, leaf mold and other things around the plants during the bearing season. He also comments on the Wilson and Crescent are very prolific, but they are only regarded as good by those whose tastes have been ruined by rum and tobacco. So we get the fun part of catching a little bit of McAllister's humor as we read some of these articles and we do this research. He grew Concord grapes on the grounds right away. He recommends the earliest ripening kinds. Pocklington and Moore's Early are the particular varieties that he recommends, and to plant none that will ripen later than the Concord should be grown in Colorado. So in other words, it needs to ripen early in order to be successful in Colorado. Winter protection was another specialty of McAllister's. In early winter, I removed the vines from the trellises, prune back, but not too closely, cover them with earth, and cut back quite heroically in the spring when the cover is removed. So not being a horticulturalist myself, I was pretty astonished to see the extent to which some of these plantings are maintained in the off season and the amount of work that would be involved almost 365 days a year, not just during the season, but in the off season also. Regarding apple trees, folks, again, I'm having to put together information for us, and I'm trying to put it together in ways that we can understand a little bit more to the extent to which McAllister prepared the soil. These are his recommendations for planting apple trees. What he does is he digs a hole that is 6 feet in diameter. It is 5 feet deep, and being an archaeologist, I can tell you, maybe the top foot is any kind of soil, and after that it is sand, gravel, and rock. So he's digging down and removing an awful lot of material 5 feet deep. Then he is putting a mixture of soil and rotten manure in the bottom 3 feet, and then in the top 2 feet he is adding a regular topsoil. And then he also adds, I didn't put it here on this slide, but he teases out the roots of the apple tree to a great extent. And those of you that have grown apple trees probably know this, but when you're planting them, you want to really gently pull the roots apart like we would for other types of plantings, but very gently and to a greater extent in order to have those roots take in that great mixture that McAllister has just concocted here. So again, he's advertising this information around the state. These folks that in each region that are the most experienced in their horticulture, they're sharing this information with others. And that's how we know this, is because he's sharing this with people in the state. Late frost. When you begin pomological activity in Colorado, you have very grave concerns about frosts that are late in the season and frosts that are early in the season. And so some of the experimentation that is going on, it revolves very closely around late and early frosts. and they're trying to find the varieties that can best tolerate that. Here's an interesting quote. This is from McAllister, and he has written to an individual in Montpelier, Vermont, where it gets even colder, as you folks know, than it does here. And he's trying to understand what varietals will bear that frost the best. And he gets great information from this individual, Famous, Wealthy, Tatowski, Yellow Transparent. And this gentleman plants those in Montpelier, which has a shorter growing season than Colorado does, and a colder winter. And he claims that it does not in the least degree lessen their crop of apples or injure the fruit in any way. So this would be the type of experimentation that McAllister would be conducting. He would get information like that from other people that have knowledge about the frost, and then he would practice that initially here on the grounds on Cascade. Winter protection, very important. And I learned some interesting things about winter protection of trees in Colorado. One of the biggest concerns was the wind and the sun on the tree itself, not up on the leaves, not on the buds, not on the fruit, but on the tree itself. Cold, sustained winds for day after day after day that, as we all know, we get occasionally, could literally kill a tree. Also harming a tree very much is the sun, the very strong sunshine that we get during the winter time also. Both of those things are very problematic for the fruiting of the trees. And what McAllister recommends is that you place either a board, that's what this yellow object is supposed to represent, that you place a board on the south facade so that it can't get that wind or the sun, or that you wrap it with a gunny sack loosely, even building paper coiled very loosely, anything to keep the sun, when the sun off the tree when the sap is down. So getting into some of the varieties that McAllister experimented with and obviously had success with. So he is recommending to growers coming into Colorado and that are starting to grow these particular varieties for these times of the year, for summer, fall, and winter. Now, McAllister didn't have a lot of success with winter growing here on the property. That was most likely because of the wind that we get on this property. It was very difficult. He didn't get a lot of production. And he argued back and forth with Joseph Wolf out of the Boulder County area. They had these kind of contentious battles of, should we continue to try to harvest winter apples, or should we just import them from New Mexico? And it's great to see this sort of feisty back and forth that McAllister participated in regarding the Horticultural Society publications and their essays and meetings. It was the source of some great information regarding pomological activity in Colorado. Here is something that McAllister was the only one to express a list like this, folks. And what he's doing basically is saying to somebody that's coming to Colorado, buy yourself a 2-acre plot, and then here is exactly what you would want to plant on your 2-acre lot in southern Colorado. So he's taking this a step further and not only recommending particular types, but recommending a blend of particular types that are going to complement each other in different seasons and that are going to pollinate each other very well and have success with. So I find this to be very interesting. This is obviously pointed towards the economy in Colorado, and McAllister is trying to participate in the promotion of apples as an economic aspect. So I've come back to this image again and kind of expressing a little bit of emotion here up top. Wow, are you kidding me? This is somebody that had a full-time job. They had mining interests. They had ranching interests. He was basically the manager of the town of Colorado Springs for a number of years. And he and his wife and kids, obviously as a family, participated in this great extent of horticulture on the property here. And again, even if I'm a little off on the number of trees or the extent of the garden, it still would have been a lot of work Now, the McAllisters were the type of family where they were going to have their kids working in this garden with them. We already know that. We know from the Gazette that Harry took care of the cows and neighbors' cows too. Surely they would have been working quite a bit on this property at different times of the year. The other thing that this tells us a little something about is Mrs. McAllister herself. She must have been very dedicated to this horticultural pursuit, because she most likely would have been the main laborer at this activity, as her husband attended to town, region, and state things. He would have occasionally been out of town on business, and she would have been the one in charge of this activity. And again, most likely 365 days a year, not just a growing season activity. But just consider the amount of work and patience and strength that this would have taken. So why did they do this? What would their reasoning be that they would do so much work on the McAllister House grounds and participate in this level of horticultural activity? The Pabers didn't participate in that much, and William Paber was interested in horticulture. We look at these properties going back here to the McAllisters, and none of these people were participating in horticulture to the extent, certainly, that the McAllisters were. So we ask ourselves, why were they doing this? What were their different motivations for participating in horticulture to such a great extent? So this picture that I've got right here, this circa 1875 picture that is taken from the third floor of the Colorado Springs High School building that burned down a year later, is taken looking north up Cascade. Now, keep in mind that what this individual did, he snapped this photograph and then he pivoted 90 degrees and walked over to the window and took this picture. And so this is looking east along Bijou and Tejon right here. This is the alleyway behind the high school in between Tejon and Cascade. And what I'd like you to focus on, folks, are these dwellings that are in the foreground here. If we ask ourselves, why were the McAllisters participating in horticulture to the extent that they were, certainly one of the reasons was aesthetic. And that was to create a community that had a high aesthetic value. What's going on, and I don't mean this in a denigrating way whatsoever, but this activity in the building that is going on in the foreground here was one of the things that Palmer and McAllister were really trying to avoid. And so Palmer would have been a big advocate of McAllister taking on this burden, one might call it, of being the primary horticulturalist in town and setting an example of what your yard could look like and your grounds could look like. Now, I don't mean to imply that there weren't nice looking areas in Colorado Springs. Certainly back over here by where the Jacksons lived, another house that Winfield Scott Stratton built, nice neighborhood, nice horticulture probably going on in these neighborhoods over here closer to where I live in the Patty Jewett neighborhood now, but they were still very concerned about Colorado Springs and its image. Remember that these colonies were sharing information, yes, but they were also competing against each other. There was constantly, people were looking kind of over their shoulder at the Joneses and seeing what the other colonies were doing and how successful those colonies were. Certainly what your colony looked like was one of the ways that they were rating. So take a look at this picture as a comparative. I think this is very interesting. This is Greeley, circa 1870. Now what this comparison really is pointing out to us is the difference in the models of development. Colorado Springs was developed very much as a business. People were able to buy small lots, right? these people were buying a small lot. It maybe was what they could afford, and they were building on that lot. When we look at Greeley, it was developed under a very different model. When these folks bought a piece of the colony by entering into an agreement, what they got in return for their money was a town lot, a rural agricultural lot, and then they got free irrigation supplied to both their town lot and their agricultural lot. So because of that, what we see in the town of Greeley are these very large lots, and quite nicely manicured, I must say, because their activity of agriculture was taking place on a lot that was outside of town. It's very spread out. It feels very nice. Certainly, this is what everybody would like their town to look like and feel like, not very crowded and with nice dwellings that were going to be around for a little while. So it's interesting to compare that early development of the two most successful colonies along the Front Range, Colorado Springs and Greeley. So aesthetic was an important aspect of McAllister's horticultural activities. The economy was a very large aspect of their activity. And in order to participate in the economy greater, the colony established the El Paso County Industrial Association. McAllister was one of the directors of the association. It had its first fair in 1874. It offered relatively large monetary enticements to people for winning in different categories. So there was a financial enticement that the Colorado Springs Company was setting out there to try to get people to grow fruit and to have success. You can see that Class E of the many classifications within this association, E was farm, orchard, garden, and dairy products. And we can just see some of the size. A $25 enticement is a pretty good size enticement for 1874. The Out West Publishing Company also offered some enticements, and we can see some of the fair ground and activities that were going on. Fruit and flowers are always a popular aspect of county fairs, and it certainly was in this successful fair in 1874 of the El Paso County Industrial Association. The association would do a couple things in the Colorado Springs area. It would help to ensure that labor and thought are bestowed upon agriculture and horticulture. So trying to get people to think about and plan their agriculture and horticulture, and what better person than McAllister to lead that effort. It also was trying to promote the growth of the population generally and the practice of the various arts and sciences. And that's quotes coming out of the Gazette in 1874. Here's a little bit of a humorous anecdote. In that same article, the Gazette quotes a Denver Tribune writer who writes, regarding the success of the El Paso County Association, her crops are much larger and better than ever before. Stock of all kinds are in greater numbers and in better condition. There are more fat babies, comely women, and stalwart men than usual. Forgive me for my language, nothing personal against anybody. I just found that to be really amusing. It's always great to read these older sources because you have to adjust to the language that is being used as you're reading things and gathering information. The fat babies, comely women, and stalwart men popped out at me as being pretty funny. So I hope you guys enjoy that. So we've talked about some of the reasons for the horticulture on the grounds. We've talked about aesthetics. We've talked a little bit about economy. And also we would have to address, otherwise be remiss, personal reasons that the McAllisters might have for doing what they did on their property. I came across this article relatively recently. We have had some hints over the years that Major McAllister was in poor health. And that may have been the reason why they left Philadelphia proper and came to Colorado Springs. It certainly was a part of their decision-making as they decided to come out to this nascent colony. The thing that interested me about this article, and I think the followers of McAllister would be interested in, is that his health seems pretty serious in this article. I am induced to this action chiefly by consideration of my health. The sedentary occupation of the past 7 years has seriously undermined my constitution, and I can no longer disregard the admonitions of my condition. So that sounds pretty serious to me. This is actually the letter that he writes to the chairman of the executive committee of the American Iron and Steel Association as he regretfully resigns from that position after 7 years. And it was a relatively good job, but he was having success in Philadelphia when the family decides to move out to Colorado Springs. I found that to be very interesting. And I think in health, we can also put the personal reason of religion. Ever since I came to the McAllister House and have been studying and researching them, I've always felt like this was their back to earth movement, coming out here from a populated area in Philadelphia to a place where they could grow what they wanted to on their own property. That's the dream of many people, and certainly at a time period where agricultural pursuits were much more significant as far as the number of people in our population that pursue agriculture compared to today, which is very few. It was certainly something that was obtainable for people like the McAllisters. So here we come back to these two books that are basically guidebooks, folks, that Andrew Jackson Downing has written and just put out to the public to see if they would use it. We know that the McAllisters used the architecture of country homes because the evidence of that and Downing's legacy regarding architecture is in the yard right here at the McAllister house, and it is the house itself is that legacy of Downing that continued through the 1870s and all the way up to the present because of the Dames preserving this house. And Colorado Springs now gets to hold this legacy. And what I'm suggesting is possibly that this other publication was used in a similar manner by McAllister. I haven't yet found direct evidence of that, but the more I research it, the more it seemed like he was a follower of Downing, at least from afar, and maybe would have used the fruit and fruit trees of America as a guide for him to begin propagation of apple trees and other types of fruit on his own property. It would have been a legacy of Downing's that would have still been quite applicable in 1870. So folks, I'd like to do one last thing and then I'm wrapping up the talk and we can take questions. I'd like to give everybody a little look into some future research that we're going to be doing. We recently have found a couple interesting objects on the property. And so since we're talking about horticulture and the ground, I thought this was an appropriate time just to give you guys a sneak preview of some of our upcoming research. We had a metal detector spend some time on the property over the last month, and he found something that was really neat. And these are his photographs. I haven't done my scientific photography yet, but I just wanted to show you folks and give you the sneak peek of this fantastic personal item that we found of Elizabeth. So Major McAllister married Elizabeth when he got back from the war, and she would have already had these spoons in her possession. They were made by a gentleman, that maker's mark is L. Latimus. Louis Latimus had this mark up until 1853, so that we know that this spoon was made before 1853. Elizabeth Cooper McAllister was born in 1836. So she would have been 16 or 17 years old, and it's probable that she received this spoon as a part of her planning for a wedding that she would have in her future. So this is a really neat piece. We can see the EC up here, and we can see the maker's mark. It was quite bent, in quite bad shape, and it was found about 3 inches below surface near the great pine tree that we have in the front yard. So that's Elizabeth Lizzie Cooper's spoon, silver spoon that we found here recently on the property. In a different direction, a couple neat things, but a personal look at this, what I believe would be a hairpin, a barrette. This is gold with white enamel on the top of it. It has come off of here. It's an absolutely beautiful piece. We don't know that that's Elizabeth Cooper's, but it may be either one of the girls or Elizabeth's. And then in a completely different direction, we found 6 .44 caliber rimfire shells in one location out on the front yard, folks. And as an archaeologist, when you find a cluster of artifacts, you tend to think of them as in relationship to each other. So it's possible that we had an incident in the front yard at some point. These shells are circa 1870, 1880 is when their use was. So I just wanted to show you a couple neat things that we will be researching. We will certainly know more information about those, but that we're also under the ground here on the McAllister House grounds, not horticulture. Well, I hope you didn't find that too dry, folks. I think this has been really exciting information for us to convey here at the McAllister House, to begin to know the McAllisters, feel like that as a community, we know them a little bit more. We know what their motivations are a little bit more. And we'll still keep pursuing research along those lines. But we're very happy to present this information to you folks tonight. And at this point, I'd love to open it up for discussion or questions. If anybody has some, why don't you maybe wave your hand, and I'm gonna open up my gallery view and I can see some of you a little bit more. Does anybody have any questions at the moment? Anything you'd like to talk about a little bit more? Yes, Carmen?
Hi, I just wanted to say that I really appreciated the whole presentation. I'm Annie Kaufman's niece, and I live over here in Houston, Texas. And she sent me the link because she had a work call at 8 o'clock, and she really wanted to be here. So I've been writing down things and texting her as we go, and we appreciate the knowledge so much, and the history is so interesting, and it's so neat because over here in Houston, it's not too much of different. I mean, I garden myself, so we're in I'm sorry, that was my dog. We're in zone 8 or 8 over here, and you guys are like zone 7 or 6.
5, yeah.
Oh, 5. Okay, yeah, and it's just so interesting to see how they used to do it back then before tillers, before pest control like chemicals and all that stuff. It's so neat, and I'm gonna definitely share your guys' information to my other horticulture friends. And I just want to say thank you, and I appreciate the presentation.
Well, thank you so much for that, Carmen. Just one second, Barbara. I just want to respond to Carmen for just a second. I think that one of the neat things is, like other activities and actions that we see in our country's history, we're getting to follow the communication of ideas, right? As an anthropologist, we always say nobody has a new idea. All you're ever doing is borrowing from somebody else and then maybe tweaking it, right? But that's what we get to do in a conversation like this with horticulture, is see how the people that were here got the information that we got. Now, unfortunately for us, we have to do that because we don't have a lot of other information about the McAllisters. So it's vital that we look at those different sources in that context. But thank you so much for your comment. We appreciate that, and it's good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think Barbara, did you have a question or comment?
Yes, I did, Eric. I'm interested in how they were able to irrigate all of the trees and the garden. I mean, that was a huge undertaking in this semi-arid climate. And being a gardener myself, I know from living here for 40 years that that is one of the things, the north wind, as you said, the sun in the winter that will suck the water right out of plants and trees. And I wonder how they irrigated. Was it by hand? Wells?
It was not. It was a part of the development, the initial development of the colony. And I'll describe it to you folks, for those of you that don't know exactly how the irrigation on each plot went. Just recently, this last summer, those of you that live in town know there's been tons of activity regarding the city and sidewalks and streets, a lot of repaving. And what they did is they actually removed the portion in front of the McAllister house that still has the irrigation ditch underneath it. And for safety reasons, they filled it in. We were a little bit disappointed for historic purposes, but nevertheless, for safety reasons, we understood. But that basically, you could call it a canal but it was an irrigation ditch, was just an open ditch, Barbara. And it would have run, you know, on this side of Cascade and of other major streets. And then it had a pipe, it had a wide joint and ceramic piping that would have come onto the property off of that main, and one of the big screws, a big metal screw that would open and close a gate. So just very similar. You can go down to Los Animas or, you know, anywhere down there and see pretty much the exact same thing happening today in the same manner. And that's what I was denoting on that that drawing, that thing that I've created, the map of the grounds, is that once that got built, then you actually had quite a bit of water coming often. Now, also, I just want to point out that that was a big challenge for this particular colony, because just think about where this population is. It's up above the creek. And so how do you get that water up here? Well, you got to create a reservoir up creek considerably so that we can get it into our ditches that are here at this higher elevation.
You mean Fountain Creek?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Certainly, that would have been a big advantage of places like the Greeley colony. They established that colony on networks of river and stream systems, like we did, but it was easier to access where they chose to put those colonies as compared to formerly where we put our colony up here on top of the higher ground.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. Yes, ma'am.
You can see those ditches running down Cascade and Tejon. Were those contemporary, or were they a later?
That's a great question. If that particular ditch itself was not, if it was contemporary, it certainly was in the same place. So you didn't have very much land to put that ditch. It had to go somewhere where the sidewalks are right now. And I think what you're referring to, and I didn't really get to complete my statement to Barbara, but there was a slab. Often you see a slab that got placed across the top of that ditch.
Yeah.
And I can walk out on Cascade and I can look up Cascade because it's one of the older streets. And we can see that slab. Unfortunately, they finally decided that that slab was kind of a hazard. You could actually look through it out front here. There was a gap. We could drop things down there or trip and fall. So yes, the wisdom of the city is put an end to that. But but
they're good if you want to avoid somebody in the sidewalk. Yes. For distancing purposes, you can go over to the ditch.
Yep. And it certainly functioned to make them safer. You got it. Anybody else with a question or comment or a conversation? Yes, Karen.
My grandmother in Grand Junction had exactly that sort of ditch running in front of her property that she used to irrigate the lawn, the flowers, the vegetable garden, and her orchard. So I was very familiar with that as a child, playing in the ditch when I went out to visit.
Eric, I have another question.
Yes, Barbara.
Harvesting. With all of these supposed apple trees, the garden I'm sure they used for the family, did they use any of the apples that they harvested to distribute to the rest of the colony?
That is a fantastic question, and all I have are hypotheses at this point. Barbara, I believe that the attic space in the house was primarily used as a storage space, a dry storage space. As an agriculturalist, you would need a bunch of different types of storage. You would like to have a cold, damp storage area, but you also would need dry storage areas that are free of bugs and mice and things like that. So I believe, for those of you that aren't familiar with what I'm referring to, there's a large attic space, and it's actually where my office is in the house right now. And we've never been completely sure, other than storage of furniture and stoves and such, what they use that for. Why didn't they, the question is, why didn't they make that another bedroom so poor Harry could have his own bedroom and not share with his two younger sisters, right? And certainly other people, there was a servant at one time that lived with the McAllisters, and she may have slept in that area, but I think it was primary dry storage. I think that they would have done some canning, and they would have done some storage and preserved those things for use. Certainly in the first few years here, I think they were acting like they were part of a subsistence economy here on the grounds. But he maybe would have gifted them or brought them to the fair also. But he wasn't going for bulk. He was going for precision. He wasn't going for mass and for bulk.
Right. Thank you, Eric.
You bet. Yes,
If
Ms.
it
Barr?
would be a ditching system that you talk about, and I remember playing in the ditches in Colorado Springs, corner of Wood Avenue and Columbia, when I was a kid. Those ditches ran, and the city crew came and dropped a gate in the ditch, flooded our front lawn from the ditch, and took the gate away. That was every Wednesday afternoon, and we had a wonderful time. We got salamanders that all sorts of things. But it was a part of a very extensive water system that General Palmer built here.
That's correct.
And I suspect if in the Story of Us exhibit at the Pioneers Museum, you'd find a map of that water system and their computer setup, and you can access that from your home during the problems that we're having with the pandemic at the moment, because that museum and all of us are closed, aren't we? Yeah. But it was a man of great vision who saw this arid Sonoran desert area that represents Colorado Springs, but saw a way to irrigate it. One of the reservoirs, of course, persists the corner roughly of Nevada and Garden of the Gods Road. I believe that reservoir was a part of General Palmer's water system. Up on North Wood Avenue, there was a reservoir for many years as I grew up. It's now filled in, and it's the Boddington soccer field. But that was a reservoir and part of this wonderful and extensive irrigation system that General Palmer built.
That's great.
Thank you, Daryl. I'll just add to that it would have been one of the first things that would have been done. General Cameron's crew that came down from Greeley that worked on it there came down, and under Palmer began to construct that almost immediately. So roads, trees, and then the irrigation. Then McAllister comes, and it's up to people like McAllister, not only McAllister, but like him, to prove that with irrigation, those crops could be grown up on the high plains of Colorado. So yes, thank you very much, Daryl. Ms. Barr, did you have a question or another comment?
Oh, when Mr. Thatcher talked about that soccer field being a reservoir, when you walk along Monument Park, and there are openings that now have been they're not existent anymore, but they communicate from the creek into that area. And so I just wondered if they were related to that reservoir, bringing water to it, or
I
I don't know.
believe so. Daryl, do you know any more about that
I
specifically, or?
don't know. I don't know anything more specific.
Uh-huh.
I did spend my misspent youth all in the North End, and we did use, let me say, Monument Valley Park, like during World War II, when there were very few people in it. I don't remember any real access that we made to that particular reservoir. We didn't go that far north too much. We were able to get into enough trouble a little bit further south in the park and that area. But certainly an extensive water system, which I don't know in detail.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Well, I have one more. I don't want.
Yes, go ahead. Go for it.
I mean, I think I also heard your talk about building of the McAllister's house, and you really give Downing a great deal of prominence as a source of ideas, and but I wonder, in the field of horticulture, was he the only one that was publishing books about gardens, or were there other people in the United States at that time that would have been part of that interest, sort of?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you so much for asking that. He was not the only one. He was the loudest one.
Okay.
His brother was actually the technician. Charles, his brother was. Andrew was the showman, and he was very good at that. He got a lot of press. He was close to New York City, so using the city as his mouthpiece, he got to a lot of people. What you would find, to answer the question a little bit more precisely, is that you have regional experts. So in New England, there were, a handful of people that Downing himself, and he would reference these people. He was in regular correspondence with those people and regular correspondence with the newly formed Horticultural Society in Buffalo, New York. And of course, like everybody else that gets into these communication forms, they debated things, they argued with each other, and there were differences. The thing that made Downing created his legacy is that we often call people lumpers or splitters. So do you tend to take information and want to conglomerate it and generalize about it? Or do you want to tend to split that information and be very detailed and precise about all the different ones? So for example, Downing had named apples that then in Buffalo, New York, they were naming it something else. And Downing would say, no, it's the same apple. You just are wanting to call it something a little bit different because you're planting it out in Western New York instead of along the Hudson. So he was a big fan of conglomerating, and where he was getting that philosophically was from England, was from London and the big research centers in England that had done the work previous to Andrew Jackson Downing. But he was really the first one, and certainly the loudest, to really desire to conglomerate all the information together and put them in these big volumes to be the most use to the people of the United States. And he was very concerned about the farmers. He was not doing this. I made him sound very flashy, and he was a good looking guy, all those sorts of things, but he was doing it for the average people in our country and to help establish our own cultural evolution instead of simply borrowing England's or somebody else's.
That's great.
Well, thank you, folks. I appreciate the great conversation,
Eric.
great questions, and thanks, Stanzi. It's great to see everyone, and we hope everybody has happy holidays. And shoot me an email if you have any questions or want to talk about this any further. We are hoping, I say hoping because COVID-19 tends to be changing our plans a lot lately, but we are hoping to plant some apple trees in the front yard of the McAllister house. Buster is going to hopefully act as our consultant and help us out a little bit there with the choice of what kinds of trees and how far to put them apart. And I've had to promise him already we're not going to plant them the exact same way McAllister did, because that would be a lot of effort. But you know, maybe we can use his tips here or there. And so we appreciate seeing Buster tonight. Thank you. Good to see you, Buster. And so look for that. We'll have a nice ceremony for anybody to be interested in the springtime when we plant those trees.
Thank you.
Thank you
Really
so
good
much.
Thank you.
Good night, folks. Thank you so much. Good to see everybody. Happy
Thank you.
holidays.
Yes. And to you as well.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thanks, Eric. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Good night, everyone.
Night.
Night.
Night.